Let's begin by looking at variables in C#. A variable is the smallest practical working block for most applications that you will construct. This isn't technically true, but practically speaking, it will be. Now, as this is the first lesson in this little mini series, we have to set up our development environment. We could go about setting up Visual Studio or MonoDevelop or a similar environment, but these days, as we're in 2016, people have already set up websites that allow us to develop in C# and evaluate that development. And one of my favorites that we're going to use throughout this section on learning C# is to be found at www.csharppad.com. So head over there now and let's begin learning about variables in C#. As I said previously, a variable is a container that holds a little bit of data. Now in C#, variables have what's called a type. So they're containers that can only hold certain kinds of data. The very first one we're going to look at is called an integer. And this is defined in C# generally by typing int. There are different kinds of integers, such as an int 16 or an int 32. But for most purposes, simply defining int will do the trick. Then a variable needs a name, because variables are there for us to use later on and reference, and a name is the correct way to do this. Now you should never name a variable after its type, so you should never call this int, because C# and .NET will get very confused and your program won't compile. So you have to give it a name. Let's call this grant age. And you'll notice I've placed the first letter in lowercase and I've placed the first letter of the second word in uppercase. And this is called camel casing. It is a common convention in C#. Don't worry, you'll pick this up as we go along. Now, we have to make that integer equal to something. So we simply type equals, and this is called an assignment operator. It's going to make whatever we put on the right-hand side, and it's going to grab it and store it inside the integer called grant age. And because we've said explicitly this is an integer, we can only store whole numbers in it, because that's what an integer is in the programming world. So my age is 33, if I remember correctly. And then we put a semicolon after that declaration to tell C# we're ending this line where we are. So now we have an integer called grant age stored as 33. Of course, we can have other types of variables. What if we have a more complicated number? Well, we can have something called a float. And we can have grant age in months is equal to whatever 33 times 12 is. I'll probably get this wrong. Something like 360.87. And floats allow us to have a decimal point, but we have to put an F at the end of the number to indicate that it is a float. We can also have numbers called doubles, and this could be age in years is equal to 33.45. And you don't need to append that with anything, so that will store some decimals for you. We can have another kind of variable called a Boolean. And we define this with bool. And I'm going to call this true or false. And a Boolean can only contain one of two values, either true or false. And we define it as true or as false. And these variables, Booleans, help us keep track of things that are switched on or off inside of our program, so they're very handy. Right, we have one more variable that I'm going to show you in this section, and this variable is something that holds letters and characters, and it is called a string. So I'm going to call this my sentence is equal to, and the way we define a string is by enclosing it in double quotes. So my name is Grant, and close your double quotes. So this stores a bunch of characters for us that we could possibly want to display to a user as a message. So in effect, think of strings as items that hold human readable words or numbers. Okay, what if I wanted to change one of these items that I've already defined? Well, I could say Grant age, and C# references that integer that I first declared, and I can make it equal to 34 instead of 33. So now that Grant age box holds a different value. It's no longer 33, that's been overwritten, and now it holds 34. In C#, there's no way to go back in time and undo this. So if you're completely new to programming, you can't simply say undo that operation and give me the old value, because the old value is gone. Now, what if I wanted to change Grant age to a string? Grant age is equal to 34. Let's see what C#pad has to say about this. I've got a little triangle on the left, and it says cannot implicitly convert type string to int. What this means is that if you have a container that you've explicitly said stores an integer, you can't then go and put a different type of item in it. So you can't put a string in it, you can't put a Boolean, no floats and no doubles. It can only hold integers. So never try to mix your variables. Now, what if my name is Grant never changes as a sentence? Well, in C#, if someone else came along on my programming team and said my sentence is equal to name is Fred, they would change the value of my sentence. And if I don't want them to do that, because I realize that I want this sentence to be always the same, what I can do is put a keyword in front of string my sentence called const. That stands for constant. And I'm telling C# and .NET this thing can never change once I've set it. That's why we're now getting our warning triangle that says the left-hand side of an assignment, and let me just expand this window, must be a variable, property, or indexer. It's basically saying, in really complicated language, that, hey dude, you defined a constant earlier and now you're trying to change it, and I can't do that. So it will give you an error. And this kind of thing ensures that other programmers don't change the strings or the variables that you want to keep constant. Okay, that's all there is really to variables in C#. If you want to know more, then simply jump onto Google and look up variables. But this is all you really need to know at this point. Just grasp the concept that a variable is a container that stores a value of a certain type.